Hello and welcome back to Times of Change read through chapter 3. So obviously last week we read through chapter 2 and that's where you got to meet Finn, the Disgraced Nimrod. Now today in chapter 3 there may be a bit of a romance blossoming, but you only have to find that out if you want to listen. So chapter 3, the meeting. Gwendolyn awoke to a warm, gentle spring air breezing through her open window. Slowly, she opened her eyes as she heard the morning bird's song and smiled. Although she felt well rested, she didn't want to get out of bed. And Gwendolyn didn't want to have the exact same day as yesterday. She wanted something different. Maybe I'll sit by the stream and fish for the afternoon. Or maybe I'll go for a walk with Lottie to another village. She thought to herself. She sighed and sat up. She rested her head on the back of the wall and stared out of her window. She lived in her own little paradise, in the open woodland area just beyond the village. She walked the stream, glistening in the morning sun, a private part of the river just a stone throw away from the house. She took a deep breath, stood up, and continued with her usual morning routine of washing in the river, feeding herself and Shadow. Then she rode to town to make her deliveries. But unbeknownst to her, today was going to be different, for it was the change of spring. She made her deliveries and added any new requests to her list of the recent orders to be completed. Nothing new, all the same. She sighed to herself. She made her final visit to the Hound and Hare. She took Shadow around the back of the stables as she always did. The poor mare was so large she barely fit with another large horse in the stables. Gwendolyn patted her mare on the nose and smiled, noticing the other horse in the stable. Looks like you'll have to share for once. Suddenly she paused at what she said. Another horse in the stable? She said to herself, looking at the creature as she had never seen a horse before. I'm normally the only one around here with a horse, she thought to herself. She saw Lottie walk from the back of the tavern. Daniel had set her to work as a stable girl, as he had never received enough guests to warrant hiring a stable boy. Good afternoon, Gwen. Look, Dad has made me a stable boy until our guest leaves. This is no job for a pretty young maiden such as me. They both laughed. Gwendolyn moved closer to inspect the new horse. Shadow seemed to watch her owner as if jealous of her attention being held on another horse. Who's the guest? Gwendolyn asked curiously. Typical Gwen, putting all of your attention on a man's horse and not your own sister's predicament. Gwendolyn's eyes lit up. A man's horse, you say? Lottie laughed. You are too old to be acting like this. Gwendolyn softly punched Lottie's arm. Too old to be interested in a man? Gwendolyn sighed, crossing her arms. Come now, it's not like that I have plenty of suitors to choose from in this village. The blacksmith's son liked you, Lottie said sadly, looking away. Gwendolyn sighed and held her shoulders, looking to Lottie in the eye. But I know how you feel for him. I don't want to get in the way of that. Has he asked you to court yet? Lottie shook her head. No, that love spell you gave me needs to be stronger, I think. Gwendolyn smiled sweetly at her. I just have to try again. She noted to herself to have a word with the blacksmith's son later. She knew he liked Lottie, she just presumed he was shy. Anyway, Gwendolyn gasped with excitement. Tell me about the man that owns this horse. Well, he's a disgraced Nimrod. So he's come to slay the dragon, the griffin. Lottie sighed. Pouting. I hope so. What do you mean? Gwendolyn asked, curiously. Well, he came by late last night. It reminded us a bit of that night when you came to us. Remember? Gwendolyn looked away. She narrowed her eyes. How can I forget? Realising what she had said, Lottie put her hand on Gwendolyn's arm. Sorry, Gwen, I didn't mean to. Gwendolyn nodded at her. Don't worry about it. Continue. Yes, well, he burst through the doors, all bloody and stinking, and asked for a healer in a room. Dad mentioned you because he looks in pretty bad shape. Dad obviously gave him a room. He's not long woken if you want to meet him, but I warn you, hold your nose. If someone needs my help, I can't say no. But you haven't told me yet. Is he handsome? Lottie giggled and pushed Gwendolyn away. Stop it, a man needs your help. But he's pretty old, so you may like him. They both laughed, pretending to fight. Daniel appeared, but his voice arrived before he did. What is all this racket? Both women jumped and looked at him like two naughty schoolgirls. Ah, Gwen, you're here, thank the gods. Sorry, I thought you were the blacksmith's son. Dad? Lottie squealed with embarrassment. But before Gwendolyn could make any fun of her, Daniel took hold of her arm and dragged her around the back of the bar. We have a Nimrod stone with us. He's barely spoken since he's woken. Just says beer. He did ask for a healer last night, and he seems to be in pretty bad shape. Never mind he's ruining all my good sheets. Do you mind taking a look at him? Now? Okay. For some reason she felt nervous. She had not treated anyone she did not know for the past 10 years. Now, to finally meet someone new and treat them, it felt a little overwhelming. Gwendolyn was surprised at herself by how nervous she felt. Yes, it'd be fine. Before Gwendolyn was ready, or even had been introduced, Daniel pushed her through the doors that led to the bar abruptly, shortly after disappearing to the kitchen. A sudden noise made the Nimrod look up from his pint. He found it funny how he heard every word they said, but his face did not show it. He felt the energy that vibrated off of Gwendolyn. He saw it almost like an aura around her, but it was much more potent than that of any mage he had been in the presence of before. This is no healer, he thought. This is a sorceress, and a powerful one. He was curious why a mage would work and live in such a small village. Mages with powers such as hers served a king. Gwendolyn briefly looked over at him and smiled nervously. She felt a little silly having not been introduced. She ran her fingers through her hair, then slowly she approached the Nimrod, as he silently stared at her from behind the bar, so intensely like he knew her from somewhere, but could not place her. She stared back at him, analysing his possible injuries, fixated on how the candlelight reflected off of his eyes like a pair of animal's eyes would, glowing in the dark from his long silver hair. The inn was low lit, and she found it difficult to see him correctly. So she walked closer to him, his gaze so intense she had to look away. She took a breath and looked back up at him, and Gwendolyn, the village's healer. The room was so deathly quiet, all she could hear was the clicking of her heels on the wooden floor and the beat of her own heart throbbing in her ears. The Nimrod watched her as she approached him, how her long raven hair flowed like silk, falling just past her bottom. She wore a tightly fitted black and red dress. She was thin, but had a nice silhouette of curves, and the dress enticed him to wonder what was lying beneath. She was indeed beautiful, her features strong, but not strong enough to look handsome. Her eyes were piercing dark grey, and the black makeup she wore only accentuated her eyes' colour further. It was a surprise she wore a nose ring. It was a small golden ring. Pretty, he thought, but never before he had seen a sorceress with such a piercing. Sorceresses frowned on such body modification. Perhaps she had the nose pierced once she left her teachings in magic, he thought. She stood in front of him, with the bar slightly higher than he sat. He watched her bosom, small but shapely, as she bent down. He smiled. Much better service than the old man, he said quietly. Gwendolyn stood up and placed 2 wine glasses on the bar with a bottle of wine. She flared her nostrils slightly, angered by his comment. Not a particular chivalrous comment to be making by a former knight, she said passively aggressively, avoiding his eyes, as she walked to the front of the bar and sat with him. As she faced him, she crossed her legs and watched how the silky material from her dress slid at the parting on her thigh and revealed much more of her strong, comely leg. It had been a long time since he had been in the company of a woman such as hers. Beg my pardon, miss. It's been a long time since I've been in the company of a sorceress. I'm a little rusty. Gwendolyn looked at him confused. She wasn't sure why he thought she was a sorceress. She wondered if it was purely because of the way she dressed, as Gwendolyn knew what she wore was overly fine wear for a simple village healer. She looked him up and down. Lottie is right. He stinks. And what makes you think I'm a sorceress? She asked, analysing his torn armour and possible wounds. I may have mutated eyes, but even a normal person could feel the magical energy you emanate. Gwendolyn was curious. No one had seen her as anything other than a healer for the past decade. She wondered if his words were true. She was quick to change the subject. She wasn't keen on talking about such delicate matters, especially matters that could endanger herself. What's your name, Nimrod? Her smoky voice only intrigued the Nimrod more as he watched her, as she looked away from him, pulling out a pipe and a small leather purse of dried leaves from her leather hip bag. She began to fill the pipe, fin of Fortriu. And please, don't call me a Nimrod. I am no longer a knight. She placed the purse back in her bag and looked at him, lighting a pipe. Fortriu? Gwendolyn asked with a raised eyebrow. You are a long way from home. Finn gave a small suggestive smile. I get around. Gwendolyn looked at him from the side of her eye. She looked at him up and down as she blew smoke from her lips. She muttered, irritated by him. So, Finn of Fortriu, a disgraced Nimrod, what is it that I can do you for? She asked bluntly. Again he shot her a cheeky smile. She knew he liked the look of her, but she did not appreciate it. Do you always call people by their stripped title? Gwendolyn cleared her throat. She did not want to become too personal before treatment, and he seemed to enjoy watching her become flustered around him. She sat tall in her seat. Apologies, let me start again. Pleased to meet you, Finn. Now, I have been told you summoned me. What ails you? She asked, breathing from her pipe. He had never been a devotee of watching women smoke, but the way she turned her head and blew the smoke from her full, red, shapely lips, he found it difficult to concentrate on anything else. Even as he felt the poison coursing through him, weakening him, Finn knew he had to enjoy the what little possible time he had left. I understand I summoned you last night. But I am to take the Griffin contract tomorrow, so any stitches you give me today will be torn tomorrow. Finn paused and leaned a little closer to Gwendolyn, looking her up and down with a saucy smile that did not leave his face. But I will be happy for you to visit me again after I slay the Griffin. She stared at him, taking a long drag of her pipe. She watched how the smoke danced around her face. She poured wine into 2 glasses and pushed 1 glass across the bar to his hand. Drink this, it's good for the blood. He nodded and took the glass. "Trying to get me drunk?" he asked with a wink. Gwendolyn chose to ignore his comment, as she concentrated on the theory she had of his injuries. He swirled the wine in a goblet and smelt the aroma before drinking. Gwendolyn had smiled. It had been a long time since she had been in the company of a true wine drinker, although she did not expect any less from a former night. "Fine, if you don't want me to examine you, but that infection will only get worse." He looked at her, puzzled. "What infection?" She pointed her pipe to the left of his arm. "It smells bitter, the telltale sign of infection. The smell gets stronger every time you lift your arm to drink." He sat back in his chair, looking at every detail of her face with an impressed smile. He found it surprising how someone that looked like the way she did put him at ease. "It looks like you are intuitive, sorceress, examining me fully dressed. Tell me, what else can you see?" She took a swig of wine. "You still have your armour on, meaning either you are so exhausted, and still are, that you slept in it last night, or maybe you're frightened of removing it and removing scabs. Maybe a bit of both. Your hair is slightly red with blood, but your beard isn't. So I guess you have some grazing on your scalp. Also, you're sitting on your right hip, making you unbalanced. Because it's too painful to sit straight? I guess you have a deep gash on your left leg, at the top of the thigh." He gave a small laugh as he leaned forward towards her. He clasped his hands together and looked at her from under his eyebrows. "Do you want to come to my room?" he asked plainly. "Excuse me?" Gwendolyn gasped, somewhat taken back by the proposal. Finn sat back in his chair, waving an expressive hand at her as he spoke. "Well, you already know my ailments. I may as well let you take a look at me and tell me how bad it is." Gwendolyn smiled, feeling a bit embarrassed where her mind was rushing off to. She quickly hid behind her hair, trying to hide her blushing. Quickly she nodded. "Yes, I can prepare the elixirs ready for you tomorrow, and have them waiting for you." He nodded. He stood up, taking his wine. She put down her pipe in an ash bowl and left her wine where it was sat. He gestured for her to follow him to his room, and she did so. Lottie and Daniel watched from the crack in the door. "She's going to his room," Lottie exclaimed. Daniel tutted, "Better not do anything under my roof." Finn wished he was in better company. Was in better condition to receive company such as hers, but he could hear from the sound of her heartbeat she was interested in him. The room was small and brightly lit. The fire was roaring, and Gwendolyn could see the state of the sheets Daniel had explained. She looked up into his eyes. He's not well, she thought, but he's hiding it well. She saw how he squinted. Puzzled, she looked about the room, then up into his eyes. "Is it too bright? Is the dark better for your eyes?" He shook a hand at her. "It's not a problem. I'm used to the light hurting my eyes." Gwendolyn sighed, quickly walked about the room, blowing out the candles. He watched her, curious by her small act of kindness. She looked back up at him as she stood by the fire. "Is that any better?" He nodded. He didn't have the heart to tell her otherwise. "But come by the fire, please. My eyes are not so good in the dark. Just close your eyes whilst I examine you." He gave a small laugh as he walked in front of her. "It's okay, I'm not a vampire. I can withstand the light for a while." Gwendolyn found almost everything he said infuriating, but she stayed calm and preferred to remain professional. She watched as he began to remove his armour in front of her. It was laboured and difficult for him. Instinctively, she began to help him. The smell of blood on his clothing was almost unbearable, but Gwendolyn did not show it on her face. she knelt and untied his boots, pulling them off. He watched her, feeling embarrassed as a beautiful mage he'd only just met was knelt, removing his shoes for him. But he couldn't help but stare. As she looked up at him, she knew the look on his face. All too well, she had seen it in many men before him. She quickly stood up, trying to not look embarrassed, and remain in a professional manner. He tried to remove his shirt, but she saw he had trouble lifting his arm. Again she helped him, getting close to him. Gwendolyn smelled the salty musk of his skin. It was a tad overpowering, but surprised she found it pleasant. Quickly she tried to push the thought to the back of her mind, but it was too late. Finn saw how she lingered. He smiled confidently, throwing his shirt to the ground. The sound of the clothing hitting the floor brought her back to her senses. Keeping her eyes low, she turned her back to him. "I'm sure you can remove your trousers by yourself," she said softly. He gave a filthy smile as he looked her up and down as she turned and stood with her back to him. "Of course," he said quietly. He walked over to the bed as he felt a little awkward standing so boldly in front of her, almost entirely naked. Finn didn't want to embarrass her any further, even as he enjoyed it. "I'm ready," he said in a soft, deep tone. As Gwendolyn turned to him, he saw how her eyes flared. It was small, and she hid it well, but he could see her attraction for him. Gwendolyn breathed quickly. It had been a long time since she had seen a man naked, and it had been a longer time still since she had seen a man that looked like him. He was strong, with defined muscle tone, but her eyes softened into a pained expression as she looked over his scars. She knew he must have had a tough life. She cleared her throat and gestured for him to stand closer to her. As he did as she asked, and instantly Gwendolyn began to point at his dirty bandages that covered his wounds. "Did you put these on?" she asked. He nodded. She sighed. "Never put dirty bandages on wounds. You're lucky all of your wounds aren't infected." She sighed, trying to lift the bandages, but they were tightly wrapped. "I can't take these off without disinfecting the wound first. I think I have some clean bandages on my horse. If not, I'll have to ride home." She suddenly looked at his forearm, horrified. "This isn't just an infection, is it? You're poisoned." He nodded. "By a bettler." She looked at him, surprised by his lack of concern. She gave a small, nervous laugh. "Oh, a bettler, of course. Only one of the most dangerous creatures on the Isles." She continued with her investigation, and knelt to feel around his wound on his leg. She smiled. The wound was large, but nothing significant had been cut. Slowly she felt something unexpected, as he ran his hand through her hair, pulling some strands behind her ear. Her heart leapt into her throat as she felt his touch. She had only just met this man but moments before, and it shocked her how he thought it was appropriate for him to touch her in such a way. She stood up. She looked up at him and quickly stood up. His hand fell on her shoulder and then slowly down the back of her arm. Although his touch shocked her, she found it puzzling how comfortable she felt with him touching her in such an informal way. Gwendolyn's lips parted as she stared at his pearlescent eyes. Suddenly his heartbeat slightly quickened, and Finn held his head, falling back. She grabbed hold of him and sat him back on the bed. "It's the poison. You're only alive because you're a Nimrod. Please, lie still. I'll be back soon." Finn felt his head spin as he laid back on the bed, and still he listened to the sound of her heels on the wooden floorboard move further away. But her scent of sandalwood and tobacco still lingered. He smiled as he slowly drifted off to sleep. Later that evening, Finn awoke to a knock at the door. His head spun and he felt sick, but still he hoped to catch another glimpse of Gwendolyn. He opened the door, but to no such luck. The landlord stood on the other side of the door, crossed-armed and not looking impressed with him. "Come with me, Nimrod. You are moving rooms." Without an answer, the landlord walked off abruptly. Finn slowly followed him, holding on to the walls of the inn, trying to stay upright. "No need, landlord. I'm fine here." But the landlord stood at the end of the hallway with the door open. As they opened the door, the sweet perfumed smell of sandalwood drifted out. He hoped she waited in there for him. He shuffled closer to the room and looked inside, leaning on the door frame. She wasn't there, but he smiled, looking about the room. It was much larger than his current room, filled with candles and incense. A bath, hot and steaming, waited for him in the centre of the room. Finn looked at Daniel. "You know I have no coin to pay you for all of this." Daniel sighed. "No need. You can thank Gwen for all of this. She's been preparing all of this for you all day by herself. She's not long left." Finn carried on staring at Daniel. "I don't understand. She owes me nothing." Daniel looked up at Finn, having a strong dislike for him. No, my lad, she does not. But she has a heart of gold. She would do anything for anyone at any time. She will not accept your coin. She just wants to help." Daniel approached him with a stern face. "Do not take advantage of her, or hurt her. I saw how you looked at her. She's had a hard life, that one. I cannot stop you being interested in her, but I can tell you," Daniel drew closer to him, "leave my daughter be." Finn nodded, surprised to know the landlord was her father. Their look did not resemble one another at all. Respectfully he nodded to Daniel. "I understand." Daniel grunted at him. "Very well, as long as we have an understanding. Grab your things from your room and move them in here. I have a lot of cleaning to do." Finn nodded and did as he asked, closing the door to the new room. He looked about the room and found clean bandages left for him on the bed with a clean shirt. The wine was left on the table next to the bath. A small vial sat on a parchment piece. He looked at the vial, then picked up the letter. "Dear Finn of Fortriu, I hope this room is up to your satisfaction. There is a bath waiting for you. It is salt water to help clean your wounds. Be careful, it will sting. There are clean bandages. Clean bandages to wrap yourself in until I see you next, and please throw those bandages you are wearing into the fire. There is wine waiting for you to enjoy in the bath. I don't know if that's what you enjoy, but I find it pleasurable. Pour this vial into the wine. It will make it taste better, and more importantly, it will slow your poisoning. The candles and incense will help you relax. I hope you like the smell of sandalwood. See you tomorrow, Nimrod. Sorry, not Nimrod. Best of luck with the griffin. Don't hurt yourself beyond repair. Gwendolyn." He smiled, putting the letter down. "You really did think of everything, didn't you?" he thought. He pulled himself from his undergarments and sat slowly in the bath. He felt every muscle twang as he relaxed. The salt stung, but he knew it was good for him. He pulled off his bandages, letting them slap wetly on the floor. He poured the liquid into the wine and sat back, taking a big swig. He let his head fall back as he thought about the sorceress. He closed his eyes, breathing in the sandalwood scent. He knew she was something different. He saw it in her aura, the way the room electrified at her presence. Also, she certainly did not act like any mage he had met before. She was much more grounded. He thought about her shapely lips, the way her eyes enlarged as she looked up at him, how her dress swung seductively around her hips. "Gwendolyn, he whispered to himself. Not so far away from the village, tired but still with much work to do, Gwendolyn arrived home with a bottle of wine and a full pipe of tobacco. She worked on the medicine needed in the village and everything she could possibly need for the Nimrod tomorrow. Little did she know, as she sat thinking about him, he sat thinking about her. He would not escape her mind, even as she worked through the night, even though he was rude, forward, dirty and unkempt. She kept thinking about his rough hands, how it felt on her skin, and his intoxicating scent. She bit at her lower lip, thinking about how his pearlescent eyes stared at her from under his long silver hair. She tightened her jaw, angered by the irrational thoughts of her mind. Shaking her head, she tried to think of anything else, something else, but she couldn't. She was intrigued by him. And that is the end of chapter 3. So if you enjoyed that, please like, comment, whatever else there is. All links to the book, if you want to jump ahead of my reading, are down in the description. And hopefully next week I will be back with chapter 4. Yes, Finn slays the Griffin in chapter 4. So that's something to look forward to. So thank you for listening, and hopefully see you again next time. Bye.